Hello and welcome to CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. This week, world trade in crisis. Even before the pandemic, global commerce was under severe strain. Economic nationalism, trade wars, and a crisis within the World Trade Organization were threatening to turn the tide on decades of global economic integration. Yet since the beginning of the year, as countries around the world have locked down their economies and supply chains have suffered unprecedented disruption, world trade has experienced a slump on a scale not seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. So, what is to be done? I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent.
And I'm Lizzie Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph. We'll be your guides, and if you like what we're doing, please hit the subscribe button. It helps people to find us. This week, we're joined by Hamid Mamdouh, a WTO veteran who's Egypt's official candidate to be the organisation's next Director General, replacing Roberto Azevedo at the end of August. We also have Lord Mandelson, a Labour peer who served in the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and was previously EU Trade Commissioner. Lord Mandelson, Hamid, welcome to CoronaNomics.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you. Lord Mandelson, you've also expressed interest in becoming the next Director General of the WTO. And when you and I spoke a few weeks ago, you said that the government at the UK had tapped you up. Do we have an announcement for CoronaNomics viewers? What's the latest from the government?
What I said was that I'd had discussions with certain ministers, and I think they're still reflecting. And they have to consider two things. One, whether they have good British candidates available to them to nominate. I think they do. But secondly, what the likelihood of success is for a British candidate as opposed to someone of a different nationality. The British government talks about global Britain. It talks about maintaining Britain's influence and sustaining the nomination of key British personalities into international positions. I agree with that. I hope they do that. But equally, they may be nervous of being rebuffed, I don't know, by other members of the WTO.
Okay.
We'll hold our breath.
Hamid Mamdouh, I want to slightly pull back a bit and just think about the situation we're in, as we described in the introduction, as regard to global trade. How bad, in your view, is it? Has the COVID pandemic, as some people have been saying, been the nail in the coffin of globalization?
I don't believe so. I think there will be changes as a result of this crisis. This crisis is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like it before because it affects the entire range of economic activity at both ends of the economy, supply and demand. And trade, of course, suffers because between production and consumption, trade is the link. When we find ourselves on the other side of this crisis, there will be certain realities. The first is a high level of debt, public debt, due to all the government assistance that is needed. Second, there will be disparities in the levels of government assistance to industries and the conditions attached, which might have some distortive effect on competitive relationships between trading partners. And there you would need a strong WTO to make sure that distortive effects are dealt with properly. And then we will see also some restructuring of value chains.
We're going to come on to some of those issues which you've just raised, but I wonder if I could just ask you, Lord Mandelson, how perilous do you think this moment is for the future of globalization and global trade?
I don't think the moment is perilous, but I think the trend is dangerous. I agree with Hamid's summary. I think it's good. The point is that what COVID did was to spark a wave of export restrictions on a variety of different goods and medical supplies. This, frankly, was born of panic. I mean, it was legal, but it wasn't justified, nor, in my view, was it wise. I mean, it tried to turn a health problem or a health crisis into a trade problem. All you're doing in that way by blocking trade is to redistribute shortages. Well, we've got to address the shortages if there are any, and not create a secondary crisis in trade. But the second thing is, and Hamid was right in identifying this, it suddenly made people all jumpy about value chains, supply chains. Have we become too just in time and insufficiently just in case? My view is that yes, the drive for efficiency, just in time efficiency, has given us huge economic and welfare benefits. But we also need to consider security as well as efficiency. So let's review where appropriate. But to embark on a response in which we're seeking to undo global supply chains and undo all the value that they bring, both to manufacturers and producers, but above all to consumers, would be a very bad lesson, in my view, or conclusion to draw from this pandemic.
You talked about the effects of the COVID-19 crisis on trade, and one of them has been that it's heated up tensions in the US-China relationship, especially after the White House repeatedly blamed China and labelled it the Wuhan virus. More broadly, Donald Trump once scribbled "trade is bad" in the margin of a speech he was due to deliver, and the WTO Supreme Court, the appellate body, is defunct because of the Trump administration's refusal to not appoint new members. And Lord Mandelson, if you were Director General, how would you handle Donald Trump?
Well, conceivably, of course, Donald Trump will be replaced by Joe Biden. And not for me to anticipate what the outcome of that election will be. In my view, if Joe Biden becomes president of the United States, he's not going to, suddenly reverse US views or attitudes towards China. But I do think that he would bring a greater strategic coherence to US policy and what the US has to do with others within the international trade system to deal with China. I mean, some people in the United States talk about China as if it's a rising power that somehow got to be stopped. It isn't. It's risen. And now we have to work out how to come to terms with that. And one of the ways in which we need to come to terms with China is looking at how China is fulfilling its obligations under the terms of its membership of the WTO. And there are issues to do with the role and behavior of state-owned enterprises in China, China's transparency on direct and indirect subsidies. There's a whole number of areas where China has got to engage China in a very serious discussion about how it's fulfilling its obligations to WTO rules. But I tell you also, in other areas, the rules themselves are not sufficient. The rules themselves are out of date. They need to be modernized. In fact, I would say the entire WTO rulebook has to be reviewed and pulled into the 21st century.
I mean, Hamid, you're a WTO veteran, and you've said before that you're the engineer to fix the car of the broken system at the WTO. But against candidates like Lord Mandelson and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala from Nigeria, the former Nigerian finance minister, would you have that political clout to facilitate a lasting settlement between the US and China?
I would not see this as a problem at all, actually, even as a senior director. I've had access to political leadership, and the position of Director General would provide access to political leaders. The question, in my view, that is more important is, once you have access, what do you do with it? And what kind of conversation would you have with political leaders in order to unpack the problems and try to make the WTO part of the solution and not part of the problem as perceived, and try to see what kind of pathways that the expertise, and because the job of a director general is not really the job of an executive like a minister who has to execute a policy. It's much more the job of an honest broker, a bridge builder, a mediator.
But we know that the appointment of the Director General is by consensus, and so it could be vetoed by any of the 164 members. And the US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer in Congress set 3 conditions for the next Director General. The third was
if I see any whiff of anti-Americanism in any of the person's past actions, I would certainly be willing to veto their appointment.
Lord Mandelson, The Guardian's quoted you as saying of having accused the US of fomenting hysteria about the Chinese tech company Huawei because Donald Trump is driving a political and commercial agenda against China. When Washington reads that report, are you confident that Robert Lighthizer wouldn't perceive you as having a whiff of anti-Americanism?
Well, I'm certainly not anti-American. There's not an anti-American bone in my body. But I do worry about this issue over Huawei because it's becoming, quite honestly, less an issue of national security vis-a-vis China and more an issue of Europe's and Britain's industrial sovereignty vis-a-vis the United States. I mean, we have a very, very important and prized security relationship with the United States, and something I attach a lot of importance to and want to sustain. But when you have a situation where a Huawei-backed research and development facility in Cambridge, which potentially could form an essential part of Britain's science base, so much of which is located in Cambridge, and you have the entire massed ranks of the American government rising against the decision of the local council to grant planning permission in South Cambridgeshire to an essential scientific research facility. You have to ask whether the US is seeing this, with a sense of proportion and sense of perspective, which I think we would expect from an ally.
Hamid, Robert Lighthizer's other 2 conditions were that the US wants someone who will fundamentally reform the system to treat the US fairly, you touched on that, and also someone who understands the nature of the problem of free economies dealing with China. How would you fundamentally reform the system to toe the line between the US and China?
What we're talking about is reforming the contract, the treaty system. And we know the only way to do that is through negotiations. This is a treaty signed by governments and ratified by parliaments. And the only way to reform that, there are these 2 sets of problems that I talked about, the compliance, and there are systems within the WTO to secure compliance if properly applied. And then to change the rules and adjust the rules, or even adjust the procedures that implement the rules, negotiations is the only way. This is why I go back to this task of the honest broker to mobilize all the expertise and the political will to engage in these negotiations.
American politicians who are saying we can't have this situation of our medicines being mostly produced in China, would you say to them that's nothing to worry about?
The problem that we were having was actually lack of security of supply. And lack of security of supply was in major part due to the limited sources of supply. The solution would not be in onshoring or domesticating value chain. The solution might lie actually in diversifying value chains and making sure that the multitude of supply sources would go a long way in securing supply in situations like this. But I would not agree at all that the solution really is in onshoring and domesticating production. And this wave of protectionism, I don't think is the way to go.
Let's also remember, Ben, that if we were to adopt an anti-trade stance and start arguing in favor of self-sufficiency rather than trade, relatively speaking, the larger and more advanced economies would be better able to pursue that policy and to become self-sufficient than other economies that were smaller and less advanced. It would be like saying, well, we in the advanced economies have benefited hugely from trade, but now we're going to adopt a policy of self-sufficiency. So we're going to pull the ladder up behind us. So your opportunities to benefit from trade amongst less developed countries, you're, I'm afraid, going to pay a price. We're going to be all right, Jack, but I'm afraid you're not going to have the same opportunities and benefits from international trade that we had. Is that the sort of world we want to create? I don't think so.
So obviously another salient feature of this pandemic is that trillions of dollars have been spent by governments, Western governments, on propping up their domestic businesses. Whole sectors of the economy have had that kind of assistance. Lord Mandelson, first of all, isn't that inevitably going to distort the playing field for free trade? And how do you see the World Trade Organization's role in dealing with that?
Well, I think you touch put your finger on a very important point, because if you're going to start restricting trade and favor, self-sufficiency, then you're going to have to use a panoply of export restrictions, state control, public procurement, licensing arrangements, which I think very quickly are going to put yourself out of compliance with existing WTO rules. So I don't think that's a course that economically we would benefit from. I think it would also weaken and undermine the rules-based system and the WTO.
We need to go back to the basic purpose behind the system. And the basic purpose is that trade is good for everyone, and that for trade to expand, we need rules, because rules are the only means of providing the stability and predictability in trade in order to expand trade opportunities. And this is really what we need. If we compromise the system that we have in the WTO, there will be no predictability and stability in trade relations, and that will compromise investment flows, that will compromise job creation, that will compromise income raises that we're aiming for. All the benefits that everybody's aiming for will be compromised.
I mean, we can't have a conversation about all trade and trade crises without mentioning the B word. Hamid, if Britain and the EU aren't able to reach a trade deal by the end of this year, they'll be trading on WTO terms. I want to ask you, is this sensible?
Well, it's not my place to say whether this is sensible. I think I see, and this is my personal view, it doesn't really necessarily relate to WTO per se, but I think the UK and the EU have been, partners, and they've been actually acting from the same regulatory and integration rule book for many years. And the fact now that they're going separate ways still does not mean that they have huge disparities to bridge. In other words, an important part of trade now is not just about border restrictions. It's more about regulatory compatibility, and the UK and the EU have been following the same regulatory framework across sectors of the economy. And that provides an exceptionally strong basis for strong and close trade relations. Even if they fall on WTO rules, I think there will still be the reality of business would still be flourishing in a way that, of course, not as strong as when the UK was a member state of the EU. But I think it is the passage of time without a bilateral agreement that will have an effect.
If Britain is trading with the EU on WTO terms, then the credibility of Britain's trading relationship with the EU will rely on the credibility of the WTO. Is it possible to reform the system enough in order to restore the WTO's credibility in time?
No. reforming the WTO is a long job. It's a long job. It's a serious job, and it's going to require a lot of heavy lifting. And I hope that Britain will be involved in supplying its weight to that heavy lifting. Now, if we left the European Union at the end of this year on WTO terms, we would pay both a short-term and a long-term price. Average WTO tariffs, which would immediately add costs to those who are trading in goods, and reduce the competitive advantage that we have in our exports to that vast market. We would pay an enormous price. But, in some sectors, it wouldn't be the average WTO tariff. It would be more like, which is 2 or 3%. It would be more like 10, 12, or even 13% in some areas, like automobiles and spare parts, or textiles, or in the case of chemicals, twice that. I mean, we would see many of our businesses wiped out by that sort of margin and that sort of loss of competitiveness. So it would be very serious for us. And coming on top of the whacking that businesses and jobs have had from COVID, I mean, it would be quite honestly, it doesn't bear thinking about, and which is why I believe this government, which has not lost all sense of perspective, I think would realize that it does need a deal. It can't deliver a second whammy of that kind to the UK economy, not given what we've been through this year.
Well, I mean, you were one of the leading lights of the Remain campaign, and it's clear your perspective on Brexit from listening to you. We've seen reports that the government's keen for a Brexiter to take over the role of the cabinet secretary from Mark Sedwill. For the nomination for Director General of the WTO, how would you convince the government to nominate you instead of a Brexiter like Liam Fox?
Well, they would have to consider the qualifications, merits and attributes of the candidates rather than base it on ideology or political prejudice. I mean, I have no reason to believe that they would do anything other than that. I hope
Optimism.
Not. Optimism. You have to be optimistic when you're running in a race like this. No, I think the government will want to nominate somebody, if it does nominate somebody who they think could win this race. And I would say I have more chance of winning it, or put it a different way, less chances of being vetoed or blackballed by other members of the WTO than perhaps Liam Fox does.
Hamid, I wonder if I can ask you, do you agree with what Lord Mandelson just said about the potential the UK could pay an enormous price if it doesn't get a free trade deal with the EU and ends up trading on WTO terms at the end of the year?
I agree with what he said about the merchandise trade side of the picture, but I'm not sure it would be exactly the same thing or would be true for the services trade part of the story, because I would look at the services sector as a sector that has enormous importance for the UK economy. It's more than 80% of GDP. And as a strong player on the services trade stage, I perhaps don't see that the UK would lose as much on the services side as it would on the merchandise trade side.
Yeah, no, that's a reasonable point Hamid is making about goods. But our very important services, remember, which at the moment have completely free ease of passage and passporting into the European single market, is financial services. If we're not on a par, if we don't have regulatory equivalence, then we're going to be facing very real problems. That's why it's important to get a deal. Diplomacy counts. Good relations are at a premium when you need to cooperate on these international issues. Junking the whole relationship just because we can't agree the basics of trade is very counterproductive from everyone's point of view. That's why I hope we do indeed get some sort of deal at the end of this year.
Okay, well, thank you so much to our guests, Lord Mandelson and Hamid Mamdouh, for appearing on CoronaNomics.
We'll be talking to many more top economic thinkers in the weeks ahead to discuss how we can weather the storm of COVID-19. So please do stay tuned and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And remember, if you like what we're doing, please hit like and share.
And if you'd like to talk to us, just leave us a comment below.
This has been CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films.